Robert Webb had been pushing a mop for 43 years straight. Every single day, rain or shine, holidays or weekends, he showed up to work. Now at 73 years old, his back ached something fierce every morning when he got out of bed. His knees made cracking sounds whenever he bent down to pick up his cleaning supplies. But you know what? His hands were still steady as a rock. Those same hands had cleaned thousands of floors, scrubbed countless walls, and polished more windows than he could ever count. The new Houston spaceport wasn't exactly known for paying well. In fact, the pay was pretty terrible if Robert was being honest about it. Most days he worked his regular janitorial shift, but sometimes he took odd jobs around the port for whatever spare change they'd toss his way. Could be $5, could be a few quarters. Today it was literally just 1 penny. A single copper coin. Bay 47, said Dennis Rodriguez, tossing the penny onto Robert's cleaning cart with a careless flick of his wrist. Dennis was the docking manager, a guy who always seemed to be in a rush and never had time for pleasantries. There's some old ship sitting there collecting dust. Owner's supposed to pick it up later today. Just clean it up real quick, will you? Robert caught the penny before it could roll off his cart. He turned it over in his weathered fingers, looked at it for a moment, then shrugged and dropped it into his shirt pocket. Money was money no matter how small. He grabbed the handle of his cart and started wheeling it down the long corridor toward Bay 47. The walk took him nearly 15 minutes. Bay 47 was way out in the forgotten section of the massive spaceport, where old vessels went to sit and collect layers of dust while their owners forgot about them or couldn't afford the retrieval fees. The overhead lights in this section were dimmer, probably to save on electricity costs. Some of them flickered like they were about to give out completely. Robert's cart wheels squeaked as he pushed through the near-empty hallways. When he finally reached Bay 47 and the massive door slid open with a groan of protest, Robert stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes went wide. He let out a low whistle that echoed in the cavernous space. The ship sitting there in the middle of the bay was like absolutely nothing he'd seen in all his 50 years of working at various spaceports across the country. And Robert had seen a lot of ships in his time. Cargo haulers, luxury yachts, military vessels, passenger liners, you name it. But this was something else entirely. The vessel was ancient, that much was obvious right away. It was covered in grime and cosmic dust so thick that it looked like someone had draped gray fur over the entire thing. The dust was caked on in layers, probably years and years worth of accumulation from sitting in deep space and then in this forgotten storage bay. But even underneath all that filth, Robert could make out something special. There were patterns carved or etched into the hull. Geometric designs that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit them. They almost looked alive, flowing across the surface like water. Well, Robert said to himself, his voice echoing slightly in the empty bay. Let's see what you really look like under all that mess. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Robert always started from the bottom and worked his way up. That's how his grandmother had taught him, and that's how he'd done it his entire life. He filled his bucket with warm soapy water, grabbed his softest brush, and began gently removing the layers of cosmic dust from the landing struts. His late wife Angela used to laugh at how careful he was with his work. She'd watch him cleaning their kitchen floor, spending extra time on the corners and along the baseboards, and she'd shake her head with an amused smile. It's just a floor, Robert, she'd say, her voice warm and teasing. Nobody's going to notice if you miss a spot. But Robert's grandmother had taught him differently when he was just a little boy, maybe 6 years old. She'd sat him down one afternoon and put her wrinkled hand on his small one. Things remember how you treat them, she told him, her eyes serious and kind at the same time. You treat something with care and respect, it'll last longer. It'll serve you better. You treat it like trash, well, that's what you'll get back. That lesson had stuck with Robert his entire life. He carried it with him through every job, every task, every single thing he cleaned or fixed or touched. Hours passed as Robert worked on the mysterious ship. The afternoon sun moved across the sky outside the bay windows, casting long shadows that slowly crept across the floor. Robert didn't notice. He was completely focused on his work, moving methodically from section to section. As he cleaned, he started noticing more details about the vessel. The hull wasn't just decorated with those geometric patterns. It was actually written on. There were symbols and characters etched into the metal, forming what looked like sentences or paragraphs in languages Robert had never seen before. Some of the symbols looked almost familiar, like they were distant cousins of letters he knew, but twisted and changed into something foreign. Robert was extra careful around these written sections. He didn't know what they said or what they meant, but they seemed important. Seemed like they deserved respect. So he cleaned around them with the gentlest touch, using soft cloths instead of brushes, making sure not to scratch or damage the ancient inscriptions. He moved to the viewing ports next, those thick windows that let the crew see out into space. They were so dirty that you couldn't see through them at all. Robert spent a good hour on each one, carefully removing layers of grime until the glass sparkled like it was brand new. Then he tackled the exhaust vents, using small brushes to clear out the accumulated debris. He even got down on his aching knees to scrub the landing gear struts until they shined. As the sun began to set, painting the sky outside in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Robert finally stepped back from his work. His back was screaming at him and his knees felt like they were on fire, but he felt satisfied. The ship before him had been transformed completely. It gleamed like a precious jewel under the bay lights. The dark metal of the hull reflected the orange sunset light, making those strange flowing patterns seem to dance and pulse with inner fire. The viewing ports sparkled clean. The landing gear looked almost new. Every surface Robert had touched now shined with care and attention. What Robert didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that inside the ship something extraordinary was happening. Ancient systems that had been dormant for 300 years were slowly humming back to life. The vessel's artificial intelligence, sleeping for longer than most human lifetimes, was waking up. It registered something through its sensors that it hadn't felt in centuries. Not just cleaning. Not just maintenance. But care. Genuine, honest care. The touch of someone who treated the ship not as an object, but as something that mattered. Robert packed up his cleaning supplies, loading everything back onto his squeaky cart. He checked his shirt pocket to make sure the penny was still there. It was. Just 1 cent for several hours of hard work, but Robert didn't complain. He'd done a good job and that was its own reward. He wheeled his cart toward the bay door, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Tomorrow would be another day of work, probably cleaning bathrooms or mopping hallways. Just regular stuff. Robert Webb had absolutely no idea that the single penny in his pocket had just bought him an entire galaxy. Dennis Rodriguez was sitting at his desk the next morning, sipping his coffee and scrolling through the daily docking reports on his computer screen. It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday morning. Nothing special scheduled. Just routine cargo ships and maybe a passenger transport or two. He took another sip of coffee, enjoying the peaceful silence of the early shift. Then every alarm in the control tower started blaring at once. Dennis jerked so hard he knocked his coffee mug sideways, sending hot liquid splashing all across his desk and down the front of his uniform shirt. But he barely noticed the burning sensation. His eyes were locked on the main display screen, watching in horror as 6 massive contacts appeared on the radar. 6 ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel right on top of them, appearing out of nowhere like ghosts materializing in the darkness. The communication system crackled to life. New Houston Spaceport, this is diplomatic vessel Starfire requesting immediate priority docking clearance for 6 ships. Transmitting authorization codes now. Dennis's hands flew across his keyboard, pulling up the transponder data. His stomach dropped straight through the floor when he saw the security classification. These weren't just any diplomatic vessels. These were top-level, maximum security, international incident if anything goes wrong type ships. Oh hell, Dennis muttered, grabbing napkins and frantically dabbing at the coffee stains spreading across his shirt. Oh hell, oh hell, oh hell. The lead ship came into visual range and Dennis felt his breath catch in his throat. The vessel was absolutely massive, easily 3 times the size of the biggest commercial liner that had ever docked at New Houston. It was made of sleek white metal that seemed to glow from within, like it had captured moonlight and was radiating it back out into space. The surface was so smooth and perfect it looked almost liquid. But what really made Dennis's blood run cold was the insignia emblazoned on the side of the hull. Even from this distance, even through the slightly grainy camera feed, he recognized it instantly. The throne mark of the Catharian sovereignty. 3 interlocking circles surrounding a crystalline star pattern. The Catharians were one of the oldest alien civilizations in known space. Humans had only made first contact with them about 60 years ago, and the relationship was still delicate, formal, careful. The Catharians didn't visit Earth often, and when they did, it was always for extremely important reasons. They were also, without question, one of the richest civilizations in the entire galaxy. Their smallest trade agreements involved more money than most planets saw in a year. And apparently, 6 of their ships had just shown up at Dennis's spaceport without any advance notice. Dennis hit the intercom button so hard he nearly broke it. All personnel, this is Rodriguez. We have a Code 7 diplomatic arrival. I repeat, Code 7. All senior staff report to the command center immediately. Get the director on the phone. Get the mayor on the phone. Get everybody on the phone. Move, people. 20 minutes later, the ships were docked and Dennis was standing at the main airlock, sweating through his coffee-stained shirt despite the cool air conditioning. Behind him stood the spaceport director, 2 city officials who'd raced over in a panic, and a handful of security personnel trying to look professional. The airlock door hissed open with a sound like escaping steam. Ambassador Regent Victoria the Ryan stepped through first. At least, that's what the translation computer said her name was in English. The actual sounds of her real name were impossible for human vocal cords to produce, something like musical chimes mixed with the ringing of crystal bells. She was 8 feet tall, towering over every human in the room. Her skin wasn't really skin at all. It looked like living crystal, translucent and faceted like a diamond, refracting light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls with every tiny movement she made. Her robes were incredible, flowing garments made of some material that shifted between colors Dennis didn't have names for. Those robes probably cost more money than Dennis would make in his entire lifetime, including retirement. Behind Victoria came an entourage that seemed to go on forever. Alien guards in ceremonial armor. More Catharian officials in elaborate dress. Human diplomats from Earth's government, all of them looking nervous and confused. Security personnel. Cultural advisors. At least 20 people in total, all filing into the spaceport's main corridor. Victoria moved with impossible grace, seeming to glide rather than walk. When she spoke, her voice was like wind chimes on a summer breeze, musical and layered with harmonics that made Dennis's ears tingle. Where is the Vesper's memory? Dennis blinked. His brain felt like it was moving through mud. I'm sorry, what? The Vesper's memory, Victoria repeated, pronouncing each word with careful precision in her perfect accentless English. It is a vessel of my family line. Ancient. Sacred. Your facility sent notification that it had arrived and was ready for retrieval. Where is it? Dennis's mind raced. An old ship. Someone had called about picking up an old ship. When was that? Yesterday? He frantically pulled out his tablet and started scrolling through yesterday's notes. His handwriting was terrible, barely legible. Old ship. Bay something. Bay 47? Dennis said, his voice coming out as barely more than a squeak. He cleared his throat and tried again. I mean, yes. Bay 47, Your Excellency. Ambassador. Ma'am. He had no idea what the proper form of address was and he was just throwing out every respectful title he could think of. Victoria inclined her head slightly, which made rainbow light cascade across the ceiling. Take us there. Now. They moved as a group through the spaceport. 20 people following one alien who glided ahead of them like a queen. Dennis's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his tablet. His mind was spinning with worst-case scenarios. Had he messed up the paperwork? Was the ship damaged? Had someone stolen parts off it? Was he about to accidentally start an interstellar war because he'd been careless with some old vessel? The walk to Bay 47 felt like it took hours, even though it was only about 10 minutes. Every step. Dennis's anxiety grew. He'd completely forgotten about that ship after telling Robert to clean it. What if Robert had damaged something? What if he'd used the wrong cleaning chemicals and melted some priceless alien artifact? When they finally reached Bay 47, Dennis's fingers fumbled with the control panel. It took him 3 tries to get his access code typed in correctly. The massive bay door groaned and began to slide open with agonizing slowness. Victoria stepped through the doorway and immediately froze in place. She went completely still, like someone had pressed pause on a video. Her crystalline skin seemed to brighten, light refracting through her in more intense patterns. The silence that followed was absolutely crushing. It pressed down on Dennis like a physical weight. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just stood there waiting for the universe to end. Victoria's entire entourage filed into the bay behind her, and every single one of them stopped moving too. They all just stood there, staring at the ship in complete silence. Dennis couldn't read alien expressions very well, but he was pretty sure they all looked shocked. One of the human diplomats in the group, a man named Paul Harrison who worked as a cultural attaché, pulled out a handheld scanner. He walked slowly toward the ship, running the device over the hull. His eyes went wider and wider as he read the results. His face went pale. "Ambassador," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible in the huge bay. It's perfect. I'm not detecting any damage at all. Every seal is intact. Every ancestral glyph is preserved exactly as it should be. Even the ceremonial dust from Kether Prime is collected here." He pointed at Robert's wastebin sitting near the ship, instead of being destroyed or scattered. Victoria moved forward slowly, like she was in a dream. She reached out with one crystalline hand and ran it along the ship's hull with incredible gentleness. Then she started speaking in her own language. Not the careful English she'd been using before, but rapid musical sounds that flowed together like a symphony. The sounds were beautiful and alien and completely incomprehensible. Paul looked like he might pass out. "The ambassador regent is speaking High Catharian," he explained to the confused humans in the room. His voice was shaking. That's a ceremonial language. It's only used for sacred occasions. Weddings, funerals, religious ceremonies. She's never used it in any diplomatic meeting I've ever attended. Dennis felt like his throat had closed up entirely. His mouth was completely dry. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as a croak. "Who cleaned it?" Paul turned to look at him. "What? Who cleaned the ship?" Dennis asked desperately. "I need to know right now. Immediately." It took 10 minutes of frantic radio calls to track down Robert. They found him in the employee break room on the 3rd floor, sitting at a plastic table with his lunch bag. He'd been halfway through eating a turkey sandwich when security showed up and told him he needed to come with them right away. They wouldn't explain why. Robert walked into Bay 47 still in his stained janitorial uniform, holding his sandwich in one hand because he hadn't had time to put it down. He was confused and more than a little worried. In his experience, when management suddenly wanted to see you urgently, it usually meant you were getting fired. Victoria turned around to face him. She had 6 eyes, Robert realized with a start. 6 crystalline eyes arranged in 2 rows across her face, and all of them were focused on him with unsettling intensity. He felt like he was being examined under a microscope. "You did this?" Victoria asked, her wind chime voice somehow conveying both authority and disbelief. Robert swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry if I did something wrong. I was just trying to." "Who taught you the old ways?" Victoria interrupted him. Robert blinked in confusion. "Ma'am?" Paul Harrison stepped forward quickly. "Ambassador Regent Therion is asking how you knew to clean the vessel using traditional Catharian protocols. Maintenance protocols that have been lost for over 1,000 years, even among our own people." Robert felt completely lost. He had no idea what they were talking about. "I don't know anything about protocols," he said honestly. "It just seemed like a nice ship. Special, you know? Seemed like it deserved to be treated with respect and care." Victoria made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and the ringing of a bell. Her entire entourage immediately erupted into whispered conversations, all of them talking over each other in a mixture of English and Catharian. "This human," Victoria said slowly, speaking over the noise, "performed the rite of vessel tending without any training, without any knowledge of our culture or customs. By instinct alone." She looked at Robert like he was the alien in the room instead of her. "What is your name?" "Robert Webb, ma'am." "Robert Webb," she repeated, pronouncing each syllable carefully. "I owe you a debt of honor." Robert reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the penny Dennis had given him yesterday. He held it up, the copper coin catching the light. "You already paid me," he said simply. "We're square." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Every Catharian in the room reacted like Robert had just slapped Victoria across the face. They made shocked sounds, musical exclamations of disbelief. Paul Harrison looked like he was about to faint dead away. "Oh no," Paul whispered, his face going even paler. Oh no. This is very bad." The main conference room at New Houston Spaceport had never seen anything like this in its entire history. The room was designed to hold maybe 20 people comfortably for typical business meetings about shipping schedules and maintenance budgets. Today it was packed with at least 40 people, and the air conditioning was working overtime trying to keep up. Robert sat at one end of the long conference table, still wearing his janitorial uniform because nobody had given him time to go home and change. The uniform was stained with cleaning chemicals and had a small tear near the pocket from when he'd caught it on a door handle last week. He felt completely and utterly out of place, like a street dog that had accidentally wandered into a fancy restaurant. At the opposite end of the table sat Ambassador Regent Victoria Therion. Even sitting down, she was imposing, her crystalline form catching the harsh fluorescent lighting and turning it into something beautiful. She seemed to glow, radiating soft rainbow colors that danced across the white walls of the conference room. Between Robert and Victoria sat what looked like half the government. There were human diplomats in expensive suits, their faces serious and concerned. There were lawyers with briefcases and tablets, taking notes on everything that was said. There were cultural experts wearing badges from universities Robert had never heard of. There were Catharian officials in elaborate robes, speaking quietly to each other in their musical language. There were at least half a dozen other people that Robert couldn't identify at all, but they all looked extremely important and extremely worried. Paul Harrison sat near the middle of the table, and he looked like he'd aged about 10 years in the past 2 hours. He kept rubbing his temples like he had a massive headache, which he probably did. Finally, he took a deep breath and started talking. "Okay, let me try to explain this situation slowly and clearly," Paul said, his voice strained. "Mr. Webb, do you understand anything about Catharian culture? Their customs? Their beliefs?" Robert shook his head. "No, sir. I've never really dealt with aliens much. Just seen them passing through the spaceport now and then." Paul nodded like he'd expected that answer. "All right. So in Catharian culture, their ships aren't just machines or vehicles. They're considered sacred objects. Especially old ships, family ships, ceremonial vessels. The Catharians believe these ships are actually alive in a way. They think the ships carry memories, the spirits of ancestors, the history of their families. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I guess so," Robert said, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. "Because of this belief," Paul continued, "sacred vessels can only be maintained or cleaned by very specific people. Family members who own the ship. Or people who have taken formal religious oaths to care for it. These oaths are serious business, Mr. Webb. They're binding for life. People study for years to learn the proper rituals and protocols for tending these vessels." Robert felt a cold sensation spreading through his stomach. "But I didn't know any of that. I was just cleaning it like I'd clean any ship." "That's exactly the problem," Paul said, rubbing his temples harder. "Or maybe it's not a problem. We're not sure yet. Mr. Webb, you treated the Vesper's memory with a level of care and respect that our cultural experts say perfectly matches ancient Catharian maintenance rituals. Rituals that we honestly thought were extinct. Nobody practices them anymore, not even among the Catharians themselves." Victoria spoke up, her wind chime voice filling the room. "You performed what we call the first teaching," she said. Her tone was gentler now than it had been in the bay, almost reverent. "You treated metal and history as if they were living things. You preserved rather than simply scrubbing away. You understood something that our own children no longer know, something we've lost over generations of easy living in automated systems." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his plastic chair. He didn't like being the center of attention like this. "My grandmother taught me to respect my tools," he said quietly. "She used to say that things remember how you treat them. If you take care of your stuff, it'll last longer and work better. If you treat things like they're worthless, that's what you'll get back." I just applied that same thinking to the ship. The moment those words left Robert's mouth, the entire room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Everyone was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been awe. An elderly woman sitting near the middle of the table leaned forward. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and was holding a tablet computer. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Helen Foster, though it didn't say what she was a doctor of. "What was your grandmother's name?" Dr. Foster asked, her voice sharp and focused. Robert blinked at the unexpected question. Angela Webb. "Well, Angela Morrison before she got married to my grandfather." "And her grandmother?" "Your great-great-grandmother?" Robert had to think about that. Family history had never been his strong point. "I think it was Ruth Morrison? Or maybe Ruth Thompson before she married. I'm not completely sure. We don't know a whole lot about that side of the family, to be honest. Grandmother Angela died when I was pretty young." Dr. Foster was typing rapidly on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "When did your family come to America? Do you know?" "We've been here forever as far as I know," Robert said with a shrug. "I mean generations and generations. Just regular working people. Nothing special or interesting about us." "What did your grandmother tell you?" Victoria asked, leaning forward with intense focus. "About the old ways? About treating things with respect? Can you remember her exact words?" Robert thought back, dredging up memories from when he was just a kid. "Little things mostly. She'd tell me to honor the threshold when entering a room. To thank the vessel after using a cup or a bowl. To treat tools like they were friends that were helping you. She had all these weird little sayings and habits." He paused, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I always thought she was just eccentric, you know? A little bit odd. But nice odd, if that makes sense." One of the Catharian cultural experts made a sound like breaking glass. He started speaking rapidly in his own language to Victoria. She responded in the same musical tongue, and suddenly half the Catharians in the room were talking over each other excitedly. Paul looked like his headache was getting worse. "Those are Catharian teachings, Mr. Webb. Ancient ones. Honoring the threshold is a traditional prayer said when boarding a ship. Thanking the vessel is part of daily rituals that date back thousands of years. Treating tools as friends is literally the core principle of the first teaching. But how would I know Catharian stuff? Robert asked, genuinely confused. I've never left Earth. I've barely left Texas. My family's been American for as long as anyone can remember. Dr. Foster looked up from her tablet and her face was pale. Mr. Webb, I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest. Did your grandmother ever mention something called the New Dawn? Or the Prometheus Initiative? Or anything about living among aliens? Robert shook his head. No, nothing like that. She just told stories about respecting things and doing good work. She'd talk about the old country sometimes, but she never said where that was exactly. I figured it was Ireland or Scotland or somewhere in Europe. Victoria stood up, her full height making everyone in the room look up. With your permission, Robert Webb, I would like our medical staff to perform a simple genetic scan. It will not hurt. It will take only moments. But it may answer many questions. Robert felt nervous, but he also felt like he didn't have much choice in the matter. Everyone was staring at him expectantly. I guess that's okay, he said. A Catharian medical officer came forward with a small device that looked like a pen. He pressed it against Robert's hand for about 3 seconds and that was it. The device beeped quietly and the medical officer looked at the display. His crystalline face went through a series of color changes that Robert assumed indicated surprise or shock. The medical officer turned to Victoria and spoke in rapid Catharian. Victoria's skin brightened considerably, refracting light in sharp, intense patterns across the ceiling. What? Robert asked. What is it? Paul Harrison looked at the data being displayed on the medical officer's device. His face went from pale to completely white. Oh my God, he whispered. This isn't possible. What's not possible? Robert demanded, starting to get scared now. Dr. Foster stood up, her hands shaking slightly. Mr. Webb, you carry genetic markers from something called the Prometheus Initiative. It was a joint project between humans and Catharians 800 years ago. A colony ship called the New Dawn was launched with 10,000 humans and 200 Catharian cultural teachers on board. The goal was to create a shared civilization. But the ship disappeared 2 years after launch. Everyone assumed it was destroyed. Lost in space. Robert's head was spinning. What does that have to do with me? Everything, Victoria said softly. Your ancestors were on that ship, Robert Webb. Those teachings your grandmother passed down? They survived 800 years, passed from parent to child, diluted and changed but never completely lost. You are descended from the New Dawn. Robert sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. His family wasn't just regular working people from Texas. They were part of something ancient and important, something that had traveled across the stars. And he just cleaned a ship with techniques that had survived longer than most civilizations. Robert sat in the medical bay of Victoria's massive diplomatic ship, feeling more uncomfortable than he'd ever felt in his entire life. The chair he was sitting in wasn't like any chair he'd ever experienced before. It seemed to be alive somehow, constantly shifting and molding itself to fit his body perfectly. Every time he moved even slightly, the cushion adjusted, supporting his back in places he didn't even know needed support. It was unnerving. Dr. Helen Foster was there with him, along with 2 Catharian medical specialists whose names Robert had tried to pronounce 3 times and failed every single attempt. The sounds just didn't work with human vocal cords. One of them had told him to just call her Blue, because of the color her crystalline skin reflected most often. The other said Robert could call him Bright. Robert suspected these weren't their real names, but he appreciated the gesture. This is just routine scanning, Dr. Foster said, trying to sound reassuring. Nothing invasive at all. You won't feel a thing. We're just going to take detailed readings of your genetic makeup. Standard medical procedure. Robert nodded, but his hands were gripping the arms of the weird living chair. He'd never been comfortable with doctors or medical stuff. When his wife Angela had been sick those last few years, he'd spent more time in hospitals than he ever wanted to again. Blue moved around him with a device that looked like a metal wand, passing it slowly over his body from head to toe. The device hummed softly and occasionally beeped. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes, but it felt much longer to Robert. When Blue stepped back and looked at the readout on her device, her crystalline skin suddenly shifted through a rapid series of colors. She showed the screen to Bright, who also went through dramatic color changes. They both turned to look at Victoria, who had been standing silently in the corner of the medical bay. The 2 Catharian medical specialists started speaking rapidly in their own language. Their voices rose and fell in musical patterns that would have been beautiful if Robert wasn't so nervous about what they might be saying. Victoria responded in the same language, her tone sharp and commanding. Blue and Bright both made gestures that Robert interpreted as some kind of salute or bow, then quickly left the medical bay. Dr. Foster looked at the data on her own tablet. Her face went pale. Her hands started trembling slightly. She sat down heavily in another chair, like her legs had suddenly stopped working properly. "Mr. Webb," Dr. Foster said carefully, her voice shaking just a little bit. "I need to ask you something. Have you ever heard of something called the Prometheus Initiative?" Robert shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Should I have?" Dr. Foster took a deep breath, clearly trying to figure out how to explain something complicated. 800 years ago, humanity and the Catharian sovereignty launched a joint colony project. This was back when humans had just started exploring deep space, back when we were still new to the whole idea of alien civilizations existing. The project was meant to be a symbol of cooperation between our two species. Robert listened, trying to follow along even though he had no idea where this was going. "The colony ship was called the New Dawn," Dr. Foster continued. "It was massive, one of the biggest ships ever built at that time. It carried 10,000 human colonists and 200 Catharian cultural teachers. The goal was ambitious. They wanted to create a completely new kind of civilization. A place where humans would learn Catharian philosophy, art and spiritual practices. And where Catharians would learn human adaptability, creativity, and resilience." "That sounds nice," Robert said, still confused about why any of this mattered to him. "It would have been incredible," Dr. Foster agreed. "But the ship disappeared 2 years after it launched. Just vanished without a trace. No distress signals. No debris. Nothing. Search parties looked for decades, including the Vesper's memory, the ship you cleaned. Eventually, everyone assumed the New Dawn had been destroyed. Maybe hit by an asteroid. Maybe suffered a catastrophic system failure. We stopped looking. We mourned the lost colonists and moved on." Robert was starting to get a bad feeling about where this conversation was heading. "But they weren't destroyed?" "The genetic markers we just found in your DNA suggest they weren't," Dr. Foster said quietly. "Mr. Webb, your ancestors were on the New Dawn. That colony ship made it somewhere. And somehow, some of those colonists eventually made their way back to Earth, probably over multiple generations. But they brought something with them. They brought the teachings they'd learned from the Catharians." Robert felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. His head was spinning. "That's not possible. My family's been in Texas for generations and generations. We're just normal people. Working class folks. Nobody special. We've never been anywhere or done anything important." Victoria moved forward, her crystalline form catching the light from the medical equipment and scattering rainbows across the white walls. "What did your grandmother tell you?" she asked softly. "About the old ways? About how to treat things? Can you remember specifics?" Robert thought back to his childhood, to long summer afternoons at his grandmother's house. She'd had a small place on the outskirts of Houston, with a garden she tended herself and tools she kept in perfect condition even though they were ancient. "Little things," Robert said slowly. "She taught me how to treat tools with respect. She'd say you should clean them after every use, put them back in their proper places, oil them regularly. She said tools were like friends who helped you do your work, so you should treat them the way you'd treat a good friend." Victoria made that chiming sound that Robert was starting to recognize as emotional significance. "She taught me how to clean without damaging things," Robert continued, the memories flowing back. "She'd show me how to test cleaning solutions on small hidden areas first, how to work with the grain of wood instead of against it, how to support delicate items while cleaning them. She was so careful with everything, even just washing dishes." "What else?" Dr. Foster prompted gently. "She had these weird little sayings," Robert said. "She'd say, 'Honor the threshold,' whenever entering a room, especially someone else's room. She'd say, 'Thank the vessel,' after drinking from a cup or eating from a bowl. I remember she'd touch door frames as she passed through them, just a little tap with her fingers. I asked her why once, and she said she was acknowledging the passage from one space to another. Bright had returned to the medical bay at some point, and he made a sound like breaking crystal. He spoke to Victoria in rapid Catharian. She responded, and suddenly they were having an intense conversation that Robert couldn't understand at all. "Those are Catharian teachings," Victoria finally said, switching back to English and turning to face Robert. "Ancient ones. Honoring the threshold is a prayer we say when boarding a ship, acknowledging the transition from ground to vessel. Thanking the vessel is part of our daily ritual practices, showing gratitude to the objects that serve us. Touching doorframes is how we mark sacred passages. But how would my grandmother know alien prayers? Robert asked, feeling lost and confused. She never left Earth. She was born in Texas, lived in Texas, died in Texas. Because 800 years ago her ancestors learned these things directly from Catharian teachers, Dr. Foster explained. And even though the knowledge became diluted over countless generations, even though the context was lost and forgotten, the practices themselves survived. Your grandmother was preserving something she probably didn't fully understand herself. She was keeping alive a tradition that stretched back across centuries. That night Robert couldn't sleep at all. Victoria had insisted he stay aboard the diplomatic ship rather than returning to his tiny apartment. They'd given him guest quarters that were absolutely enormous, bigger than his entire apartment back on Earth. The room had actual windows, not screens or pictures, but real transparent sections of the hull that showed space outside. Robert stood at one of those windows for hours, watching Earth rotate slowly in the darkness below. The planet looked so beautiful from up here, blue and white and green, wrapped in swirling clouds. Somewhere down there was Houston. Somewhere was his little apartment with his wife's pictures still on the walls. Somewhere was the spaceport where he'd worked for 43 years. He thought about Angela, his wife, who'd loved his grandmother's old stories. Angela had always said there was something special about the way Robert treated objects, the care he showed even for simple everyday things. She'd called it his gentle touch. She'd loved that about him. He thought about his daughter Jennifer, who he barely talked to anymore after Angela died. The grief had built a wall between them that neither of them knew how to climb over. Jennifer had 2 kids, Robert's grandchildren, who he hardly knew. He thought about his grandson Tyler, who was 14 now. Robert had only met him a handful of times, but he'd noticed something. Tyler was always so careful with his belongings. He'd line up his books just so, arrange his toys in perfect order, treat his bicycle like it was made of glass. Jennifer thought it was just a phase, maybe mild OCD. But now Robert wondered if it was something else. Something older. Something passed down through blood and bone. Maybe it ran in the family deeper than anyone knew. Maybe somewhere in Tyler's DNA was the memory of the new dawn, calling across 800 years, teaching him to care for things the way his alien ancestors had once taught his human ancestors. Robert pressed his hand against the cool window, looking out at the stars scattered across the infinite darkness. Somewhere out there the new dawn had traveled. Somewhere out there his ancestors had lived and loved and learned. And somehow, impossibly, they'd made it home again. He was Robert Webb, janitor from Houston, Texas. And he was also the inheritor of an 800-year-old legacy that stretched across the stars. Robert's apartment in Houston felt smaller than he remembered. He stood in the doorway after returning from the diplomatic ship, just staring at the familiar space like he was seeing it for the first time. The walls seemed to close in on him, every inch covered with memories. Pictures of Angela hung everywhere. His late wife smiling at the beach. Angela in her wedding dress. Angela holding their newborn daughter. There were photos of Jennifer as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. School pictures of Tyler and his sister Katie, formal poses with forced smiles. The apartment felt like a museum of his life, and he felt like a stranger walking through it. Outside his window he could see news vans parked along his street. Reporters with cameras and microphones were camped out on the sidewalk, waiting for him to emerge. His phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, buzzed constantly with notifications. He'd turned off the ringer hours ago, but he could still see the screen lighting up every few seconds. 300 unread messages. Maybe more by now. He didn't want to look. The gifts from the Catharians sat in boxes stacked around his tiny living room, completely overwhelming the space. There were art pieces that Victoria had insisted he accept, sculptures made of materials that seemed to shift and change color when you looked at them from different angles. The authentication certificates said they were worth millions of dollars. Millions. Robert couldn't even comprehend that kind of money. There were deeds to properties on 3 different planets, printed on some kind of crystalline paper that hummed softly when you touched it. A house on Kether Prime. An estate on New Harmony Colony. A research station on Deneb 7. Places Robert had never heard of, would probably never visit, but apparently now owned. There were pieces of technology he couldn't begin to understand. Communication devices. Medical scanners. Something that Victoria had called a molecular restructurer that could apparently turn any raw material into nutritious food. They all sat in their fancy boxes with instruction manuals written in both English and Catharian, and Robert had no idea what to do with any of them. It all felt wrong. Like someone else's life had been delivered to his apartment by mistake. The knock on his door came late in the afternoon, so quiet and tentative that Robert almost didn't hear it. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the past 3 days. When he opened the door, his daughter Jennifer was standing there in the hallway. She looked nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot, her hands clutching the strap of her purse. She looked older than her 42 years, with tired lines around her eyes and gray starting to show in her dark hair. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. They hadn't spoken in person in almost 6 months. "Jenny," he managed to say. He stepped aside, gesturing into the apartment. "Come in. Sorry about the mess." Jennifer walked in, her eyes going wide as she took in all the boxes and gifts scattered around. "Dad, what is all this stuff?" "That's kind of a long story," Robert said. "You want some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." They sat in the kitchen at the small table where Robert and Angela had eaten breakfast together for 30 years. Robert poured 2 cups of coffee, adding cream and sugar to Jennifer's just the way she liked it. He remembered. They sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and for a moment it felt like old times. Before Angela died. Before the grief built walls between them that neither knew how to tear down. "I saw the news," Jennifer said finally, breaking the silence. "They're calling you the man who saved an alliance with aliens. They're saying you performed some kind of miracle. Dad, what's really going on?" Robert took a deep breath and told her everything. The whole story from start to finish. Cleaning the ship in Bay 47 for a penny. The Catharians arriving with their diplomatic fleet. The debt of honor. The genetic testing that showed he was descended from the New Dawn colony ship. The 800-year-old teachings that had survived in their family through generations of grandmothers passing down simple wisdom about respecting tools and honoring thresholds. Jennifer listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Her eyes got wider and wider as the story went on. When Robert finally finished, she just sat there in stunned silence for a long moment. "Great-great-grandmother Ruth," Jennifer said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom used to tell me about her weird sayings. All those little rules and rituals. I thought they were just old person things. Superstitions or habits from some old country tradition we'd forgotten. Turns out they meant something," Robert said. "Something bigger than any of us knew." Jennifer looked around at all the boxes filling the living room. "So what are you going to do?" "Dad, they're offering you everything. Money, property, technology. You could retire. You could live anywhere you wanted. You could have anything." Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in months. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the worry lines carved deep by stress and struggle. Jennifer worked as a nurse at a public hospital, pulling long shifts for decent but not great pay. She had 2 kids to raise on her own since the divorce 3 years ago. Tyler was 14, Katie was 11. Jennifer was always worried about money, always stressed about bills and school costs and medical expenses. "I don't want their money," Robert said slowly. "That's not what this is about for me. But I made a deal to teach people. The Catharians want me to show their young people how to care for things properly, how to maintain vessels the old way. And there's something else too." He leaned forward, his weathered hands flat on the table. "They're looking for other descendants of the New Dawn. People like us, carrying pieces of this old knowledge without even knowing it. Families who've preserved these teachings across 800 years without understanding why. Those people deserve to know their history. They deserve to know they're part of something important." "What does that mean for us?" Jennifer asked quietly. "For me and the kids?" Robert stood up and retrieved a tablet from the counter, one that Victoria had given him before he left the diplomatic ship. He placed it on the table and pushed it across to Jennifer. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. The Catharians prepared this document. They're offering to help my family but not as charity. They're doing it because you're part of this heritage too. You and Tyler and Katie all carry the same genetic markers I do. You're descendants of the New Dawn just as much as I am." Jennifer picked up the tablet with shaking hands. She scrolled through the document, her eyes scanning the text. Robert watched her face go through a series of emotions. Disbelief. Hope. Fear. More hope. "Education funds for Tyler and Katie," she read aloud. "Full scholarships to any university they want to attend, human or Catharian. Job opportunities in cultural exchange programs. Medical benefits. Housing assistance." She looked up at Robert, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Dad, this is too much. We can't accept all this." "Why not?" Robert asked gently. "It's not charity, Jenny. You're part of this story. Your kids are part of it. They deserve the chance to learn about where they came from." Jennifer set down the tablet and wiped at her eyes. "Dad, I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for pulling away after Mom died. For not calling. For not visiting. For not understanding why you kept working that janitor job instead of retiring. I thought you were just trying to avoid dealing with life. I thought you didn't want to spend time with us because it was too painful without Mom." Robert reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. His palm was rough and calloused from decades of work, but his grip was gentle. "These hands know what they're doing," he said softly. "Work is what kept me going after your mother died. Coming to the spaceport every day, cleaning things, making them better, making them right. It gave me purpose. Your mother understood that about me. She always understood." Jennifer squeezed his hand tightly. "Can I see it?" she asked. "The ship you cleaned? The one that started all this?" They went together the next day, early in the morning before the crowds and reporters could find them. Robert used his employee badge to get them into the spaceport through a side entrance. They walked through the quiet corridors together, father and daughter, not speaking but comfortable in the silence. Bay 47 still held the Vesper's memory. The ship gleamed under the overhead lights, every surface clean and perfect, those strange geometric patterns flowing across the dark metal hull like frozen water. Robert showed Jennifer everything. He pointed out the ancient glyphs carved into the metal, explaining how he'd been extra careful cleaning around them even though he hadn't known what they meant. He showed her the viewing ports that he'd polished until they sparkled like diamonds. He demonstrated how he'd supported the delicate sensor arrays while cleaning them, treating each component like it was made of glass. Jennifer ran her hand along the hull slowly, reverently. Her fingers traced the patterns in the metal. Robert watched her face and saw something there, some flicker of recognition. Like some deep part of her remembered this, even though she'd never seen anything like it before in her life. "Grandma Angela was right," Jennifer whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Things do remember. They remember how you treat them." Robert nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "That's the lesson, Jenny. That's what we've been carrying all this time. Respect. Care. Treating everything and everyone like they matter because they do." Over the next 3 months, Robert's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. He didn't retire. He didn't stop being a janitor. Instead, he became something more, something bigger while still keeping his hands on the work he loved. The Catharians built a new human Catharian cultural center in Houston, specifically for the exchange program. It was a beautiful building, all flowing curves and crystalline windows, but inside it had regular floors that needed sweeping and windows that needed cleaning. Robert worked there every day pushing his cart through the halls. But now behind him walked students. 15 of them in the first class. 8 humans, 7 Catharians, ranging in age from 16 to 23. They watched everything he did. They learned not just how to clean but why it mattered. How care and respect could be expressed through simple actions. How treating objects with dignity was really about treating people with dignity. Jennifer came to work at the center too. She taught classes on human history and Catharian philosophy, using the education she'd started pursuing with the funds from Victoria's offer. Tyler attended classes after school, learning about his heritage, discovering that his careful nature wasn't weird or obsessive but actually a gift passed down through countless generations. Ambassador Regent Victoria Theron came to the center regularly, no longer wearing her elaborate diplomatic robes but simple working clothes. She attended Robert's classes like any other student, learning from the old janitor who had accidentally preserved her civilization's most sacred traditions. One evening, as Robert was finishing his rounds, he found a young Catharian student sitting alone in the empty lecture hall. She was crying, her crystalline form flickering with colors that Robert had learned meant sadness and frustration. Her name translated to something like Morning Light, but she'd asked everyone to call her Lucy. "I don't understand," Lucy said when Robert sat down beside her. "I know all the facts about the first teaching. I've memorized every ritual and protocol. But my instructors say I'm missing something fundamental, and I don't know what it is." Robert looked at her gently. "Show me your hands," he said. Lucy held out her crystalline hands, confused. Robert took them carefully in his own weathered human hands. The contrast was striking. Her hands smooth and perfect and reflecting rainbow light. His hands rough and scarred and marked by 73 years of hard work. "These hands can do anything," Robert told her. "But first they have to learn to care. Not just know about caring but really feel it. Come on, I'll show you what I mean." He took Lucy to a storage room full of training equipment and cleaning supplies. Together they spent the next 2 hours cleaning and organizing. Robert showed her how to pay attention to what she was doing, how to move with purpose and intention, how to treat every single object like it mattered. Not because someone was watching or grading her, but because it was the right thing to do. By the end, Lucy was smiling, her crystalline form glowing with colors that meant happiness and understanding. "I get it now," she said with wonder in her voice. "It's not about the doing. It's about the how and the why." "Now you're learning," Robert said warmly. That night, Robert walked home from the cultural center, pushing his cart along the sidewalk in the warm Houston evening. He was whistling a tune that his grandmother Angela had taught him when he was just a little boy, 80 years ago. The same tune her grandmother had taught her. The same tune that had probably traveled aboard the New Dawn 800 years ago, carried by people who dreamed of building something new among the stars. The penny he'd earned for cleaning the Vespers memory sat in a museum now, mounted in crystal with spotlights and explanatory plaques. Tourists came to see it every day, this single copper coin that had somehow helped restore an alliance between two civilizations. But Robert kept a copy of that penny in his pocket. Not as a symbol of his importance or fame. Not because it was worth anything. But as a simple reminder of a simple truth. Every job is worth doing right. Every person deserves dignity and respect. Every small act of care ripples forward through time in ways you can't predict or control. Robert Webb was just a janitor. Just a cleaner. Just a human doing the work that needed doing, the same way his grandmother had taught him, the same way her grandmother had taught her, in an unbroken chain stretching back across centuries. And that, in the end, was everything that mattered.